There is a meeting that happened in 1967 that almost nobody knows about. It lasted less than 40 minutes. No cameras. No press. No official record. But the man who walked out of that room, a decorated United States Army general with 30 years of military experience, told a colleague the same night that what he had just witnessed was the most unsettling thing he had ever seen in his life. And this man had been to war. The person who unsettled him was not a soldier. He was not a weapon. He was a 26-year-old martial arts instructor from Hong Kong named Bruce Lee. And what happened in that room, what Bruce Lee did and what he said has never been fully told. Until now. How it began to understand why Bruce Lee ended up at the Pentagon, you have to understand what America was going through in 1967. The Vietnam War was at its most brutal. American soldiers were dying by the thousands in jungle warfare, a kind of combat that conventional military training had almost completely failed to prepare them for. Hand-to-hand, close quarters, unpredictable, savage. The enemy was smaller, faster, and fighting on their own terrain. And the American military, for all its firepower and resources, was struggling with something it had never had to face before. The problem wasn't weapons. The problem was the human body. What it could do. What it could withstand. How fast it could move when trained in a completely different way. Senior military officials had begun, quietly, to reach out to experts outside the traditional military world. Martial artists.
Combat spécialiste.
People who understood the body as a weapon in ways that West Point had never taught. One name kept coming up. Not from the military itself. From Hollywood. From people who had watched Bruce Lee move on a film set and come away genuinely shaken. The phone call, the man who made the call was not Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee didn't know this was coming. The call went to a man in his circle, a connection, a mutual acquaintance. Someone who moved between the world of entertainment and the world of government in that particular way that only certain people in 1960s Los Angeles could. The message was simple. There are some people who would like to observe a demonstration. It would be private. It would be brief. It would be in Washington. When this was relayed to Bruce Lee, his first reaction, according to people close to him at the time, was not excitement. It was suspicion. Bruce Lee had spent the better part of 6 years in America being told, in various polite and impolite ways, that he did not belong. That his ideas were too foreign. That his methods were too unorthodox. That the way he fought, the way he thought, the way he moved, it was impressive, yes, but not quite right for American tastes. And now suddenly the United States military wanted to watch him? He agreed. But he had conditions. He would demonstrate what he chose to demonstrate. He would answer questions honestly. And he would not be treated like a circus act. The conditions were accepted. Now, here is where the story takes a turn that nobody expected. The man Bruce Lee was before we get to what happened inside that room. And we will get there, I promise. You need to understand something about Bruce Lee in 1967 that most people have completely wrong. Most people think of Bruce Lee as a fighter. A fast one. A brilliant one. The greatest martial artist who ever lived. And yes, all of that is true. But in 1967, Bruce Lee was something else first. He was a teacher. He had been running his own martial arts school, Jun Fan Gung Fu, since he was 19 years old. First in Seattle, then in Oakland, then in Los Angeles. And in those schools, he had done something that was genuinely radical for its time. He taught everyone. Black students. White students. Hispanic students. In 1960s America, when most martial arts schools in the country were ethnically segregated, when Chinese masters refused to teach anyone who wasn't Chinese, when American gyms had their own quiet color lines, Bruce Lee opened his doors to anyone who wanted to learn. He was investigated for it, challenged for it, threatened for it. There is a story, and this one is documented, where a group of Chinese martial artists in San Francisco sent representatives to his school and formally demanded that he stop teaching non-Chinese students. Bruce Lee listened to them politely. He said no. They challenged him to a fight to settle the matter. He agreed. The fight lasted 3 minutes. The representatives left. Bruce Lee never closed his doors. But here is what that story tells you about the man who walked into the Pentagon in 1967. He was not afraid of authority. He was not impressed by titles. And he had never once in his life changed who he was because someone powerful told him to. That combination, in a room full of generals, was about to create something extraordinary. If you love Bruce Lee stories, subscribe. I post rare stories every day. The meeting took place in a conference room. Long table. Fluorescent lighting. The smell of coffee and floor wax. There were 6 men present. 4 in uniform. 2 in civilian clothes. No introductions beyond first names and titles. Bruce Lee arrived alone. No assistant. No manager.
No entourage.
He was wearing plain clothes. Dark trousers. A simple shirt. He looked, by every account, completely relaxed. One of the men present would later describe the moment Bruce Lee walked in as the first thing that surprised them. They had been expecting someone who looked like a fighter. Broad shoulders. Visible aggression. The kind of physical presence that fills a room before the person even opens their mouth. Bruce Lee was 5 feet 7 inches tall. He weighed around 135 pounds. He looked, standing in the doorway of a Pentagon conference room, almost unremarkable. Almost, because the moment he moved, even just to cross the room and shake hands, something changed. One of the generals later said that he had shaken hands with thousands of men in his career. Senators, heads of state, the toughest soldiers he had ever trained. He said Bruce Lee's handshake was the only one that ever made him feel, for one involuntary fraction of a second, genuinely unsafe. Not because it was crushing. Not because it was aggressive. Because it was completely, perfectly controlled. Like shaking hands with something that had decided, very deliberately, to be gentle. That was the moment the generals understood that this was not going to be an ordinary meeting. The demonstration they asked him to begin. Bruce Lee looked around the room for a moment. Then he asked a question that nobody had anticipated. He said, "Which one of you is the strongest?" The men exchanged glances. One of them, a large man, former linebacker before the army, built like a door, raised his hand slightly. Bruce Lee nodded. He asked the man to stand up and try to stop him from completing a simple movement. The large man stood. He outweighed Bruce Lee by at least 80 pounds. He smiled a little. The way you smile when you are absolutely certain of the outcome. What happened next took less than 2 seconds. Bruce Lee did not strike him. He did not throw him. He did not do anything that looked, from the outside, like fighting at all. He simply moved. And the large man found himself completely unable to prevent it. Not because he was slow. Not because he wasn't trying. But because by the time his brain had processed what Bruce Lee was doing and sent the signal to his body to react, the movement was already over. The room was very quiet for a moment. Then one of the men in civilian clothes said quietly, "Do that again." Bruce Lee did it again. Same result. Then a third time with a different volunteer. Same result. One of the generals pushed back from the table, walked to the window, and stood there looking out for a long moment with his hands clasped behind his back. Then he turned around and asked Bruce Lee a question that nobody in the room had expected. He said, "How long would it take to teach this to a soldier?" Bruce Lee was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that the men in that room would think about for years afterward. He said, "You cannot teach this to a soldier. You can only teach it to a person who is willing to stop thinking like a soldier." The room went very still. What he meant now here is where most people, hearing this story, make a mistake. They hear you cannot teach this to a soldier and they think Bruce Lee was being arrogant, or difficult, or deliberately mysterious. He was not. He was saying something that he had spent his entire adult life trying to articulate. Something that was at the absolute core of everything he believed about martial arts, about the human body, about the nature of combat itself. He was saying that the way the military trained soldiers, the repetition, the rigid structure, the emphasis on following orders and executing predetermined responses, was the exact opposite of what made a person dangerous in true close combat. Because in true close combat, there is no time for predetermined responses. There is no time for a pattern. There is only the present moment, and what your body knows how to do when your thinking mind gets out of the way. Bruce Lee had a philosophy he called using no way as way. It sounds like a riddle. It sounds like something from a fortune cookie. But in that conference room in 1967, surrounded by men who had spent their careers building systems and structures and protocols for violence, it landed like a bomb. Because they understood, in that moment, that everything they had been doing was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what the human body is actually capable of. Bruce Lee wasn't teaching them a new technique. He was telling them their entire framework was wrong. And they knew he was right. The aftermath, the meeting ended without fanfare. Handshakes. Polite words. Bruce Lee walked back out through the same door he had entered. No contract was signed. No official relationship was established. Nothing was put on paper. But something happened in the years that followed that is very difficult to call a coincidence. Beginning in the late 1960s, the United States military began, quietly, to completely restructure its approach to hand-to-hand combat training. The rigid, system-based methods that had defined military close-quarters training since World War II began to give way to something more fluid, more adaptive, more focused on the individual body's instinctive capacity rather than memorized sequences of movement. Programs emerged, new training philosophies, new approaches to what soldiers were taught about their own bodies and their own instincts. None of them mentioned Bruce Lee. None of them needed to. The general who had stood at the window and asked how long it would take to train a soldier, that man quietly became one of the most significant advocates for reformed combat training in the Army for the next decade. He never gave an interview about it. He never wrote about Bruce Lee in his memoirs. But a colleague of his, in a private letter written years later that was only discovered after both men had died, described a conversation in which the general said this. That young man in 1967 told us something we should have already known. We spent 20 years learning it the hard way. 20 years. Think about what that means. Think about what it cost. If you love Bruce Lee stories, subscribe. I post rare stories every day. The moral blow here is what strikes me most about this story. Bruce Lee walked into the most powerful military building in the world. Alone. Unannounced.
No rank. No credentials.
No country behind him. Just a body he had spent his entire life building into something that nobody had words for yet. And in 40 minutes, he made some of the most powerful men in America question everything they thought they knew about strength, about speed, about what a human being is actually capable of. He didn't do it by being bigger. He didn't do it by being louder. He didn't do it by having the right connections or the right name or the right face. He did it by being so completely, so thoroughly, so relentlessly himself, that there was no framework in the room capable of containing him. That is what they could not teach. That is what cannot be put in a manual. Not a technique. Not a drill. Not a sequence. The willingness to strip away everything you have been told you are supposed to be, and to move, instead, from what is actually true. Bruce Lee was 32 years old when he died. In those 32 years, he had been rejected by Hollywood, challenged by his own community, ignored by institutions, and dismissed by people with more power and more resources than he would ever have. And every single time, he walked into the room anyway. Alone. Relaxed. Completely certain of what he was. That is the lesson. Not the punch. Not the kick. Not the philosophy written in the notebooks. The lesson is the walk. The way he came through the door.